My name is Calloway. I am 32 years old. The thing that shattered the peace it had taken me nearly 20 years to build was not a death notice, not a late apology, and not a confession. It was 29 missed calls from Illinois. That morning, I stood in my kitchen with a steaming cup of coffee in one hand and my phone in the other, staring at the screen so long I did not even notice when the coffee went cold. I did not need to listen to the voicemail to know the past had found its way back to me. Some memories do not die. They just lie still, deep and dark, until one ordinary morning, they suddenly sit up and drag you right back to the place you have spent your whole life trying to escape. For me, that place was a train station. A station far too big for a 12-year-old girl. It was the sound of announcements echoing overhead. $9 in my jacket pocket. The feeling of my stomach dropping when I saw my parents' car pass by the glass doors, and heard them laughing, as if my fear were just some little joke to entertain them on the drive home. If you have ever had one sound, one name, or one number powerful enough to pull a pain out of the ground where you thought you buried it, then you know exactly what that feels like. And before I tell you what they wanted after all those years, tell me honestly, has your past ever come back to you through something that small? I grew up in a house that, from outside the fence, looked like the kind of place where a child should have been safe. It sat on a clean street, with a neatly trimmed lawn, curtains changed with the seasons, and flower pots lined up on the porch, as if everything in my mother's life was always under control. My parents owned several home goods stores in the area. They sold the familiar things of everyday life: coffee makers, bed sheets, kitchenware, table lamps, the kinds of things that make a house look warm and decent. And maybe that was why people found it so easy to believe that two people who sold warmth to everyone else must have known how to keep their own family warm too. The neighbors always said my mother was sharp, organized, and good at raising children. My father was known as funny, hardworking, and easy to be around. I heard those things early, and often enough to understand that there were two versions of my family living side by side, one for the outside world, and one meant only for me. In my house, love was never something freely given. It always came with conditions, with tests, with a price I often did not even realize I had been paying. My mother had one word she loved to use: lesson. She said it in such a calm voice that outsiders might have mistaken it for devotion. But in our house, a lesson could begin over something very small. If I spilled milk, my mother would stare at the white mess spreading across the table and say, "You need to learn how to be less careless." If I forgot to bring something, she would not remind me or help me. She would just let me stumble through it, and then say in that cool voice, "At least next time, you will remember how this embarrassment feels." If I came home upset over something at school, she never asked who hurt me. She would just frown as if I had interrupted her with a weakness she did not have time for. "What are you crying for?" she once said to me, still folding napkins neatly at the kitchen table. "People will only look down on you for it." My father usually did not step in to stop her. That was what stayed with me even longer than the things my mother said. He would stand nearby, leaning against the counter, smirking as if it were all part of some familiar little performance. Some days he even added his own lines, soft and steady, like background music to an old song. "Your mother's right," he would say. "The real world is not going to comfort you." The thing they called discipline did not make me stronger, no matter how often they claimed it would. It just made me smaller. I learned to read my mother's face before I spoke. I learned to measure my father's tone, so I would know whether that day he would stay out of it or join in. I learned to swallow my questions before they ever made it out of my mouth. Little by little, I stopped trying to be understood. I only tried not to become the reason the air in the house changed, and somewhere along the way I started believing the safest way to make it through a day was to become very small, very good, very quiet, almost invisible. When I was 8, the toes of my sneakers had split open so badly that every step made the fabric peel back like a mouth trying to say something humiliating for me. I was not asking for something pretty. I was not whining. That day at the mall, I just tugged lightly on my mother's sleeve and said in a very small voice, "Mom, I think I need new shoes." My mother stopped walking, looked down at my feet, then looked back at my face for longer than she needed to. That look made me wish right away that I had never opened my mouth. "You think you need them?" she asked, her voice light and cold. "Then today you are going to learn something. Nobody owes you anything, just because you want it." She pointed to a chair near the pretzel stand and told me to sit there and think very carefully about the difference between needing something and demanding something. I still remember the smell of sweet butter and cinnamon in the air. I remember the people passing by. I remember how straight I sat, my hands clasped together, because I was afraid that if I moved too much, I would be seen as disrespectful. 1 hour passed. Then 2. Then almost 3. I did not dare leave. I did not dare ask anyone for help. I did not dare cry out loud. When my parents finally came back, my father looked at me and laughed. "So I won?" he asked my mother. "You owe me $20. He said it the way people talk about a fun little bet between adults on the drive home, not about their 8-year-old daughter, still sitting exactly where they left her. I stayed silent, listening to them laugh, and learned that even the most ordinary need could be turned into something shameful, something you had to pay for. By the time I was 10, I had learned how to stay quiet better than before. But even that did not stop me from being chosen. One afternoon after a game at school, some older boys stood by the parking lot making fun of my hair, the way I ran, the way I held my backpack. I tried to hold it together until I got in the car, but the second the door shut, I started crying. My mother turned to look at me as if I had dirtied the air inside the car. "You are crying over that?" she said. "How are you supposed to survive in this world?" Before I could answer, my father drove to the far end of the lot, where it was emptier, and the evening light was already fading fast. He stopped the car, unlocked the back door, and said, almost cheerfully, "Get out. If you want to be strong, start here." I thought they were bluffing. But my mother turned around, her eyes steady. "Sit there until you understand that weakness only gives people something to step on." I got out. The door shut. The car drove away while dusk gathered, and the other cars slowly disappeared. I sat on the concrete curb, hugging my knees, staring across the wide, empty lot like it was a place with no human voices left in it. When they came back nearly an hour later, my father was holding a bag of fast food. I smelled the fries before either of them said a word. "Your mother said you would stay right here," my father laughed. "Looks like I won again." Nobody apologized. Nobody asked if I had been scared. The only thing anyone seemed to care about was that I had not run, not made trouble, not created one more inconvenience. After things like that, I started memorizing the wrong rules, as if they were the only way to survive. Do not cry, do not need anyone, do not expect anyone to protect you. I learned to read grown-ups before I spoke, to fold in on myself before I became the next target, and on the days when the sound of their laughter stayed in my ears longer than the evening itself, the only place I still felt real was on paper. I drew windows opening into other places. I drew trains leaving stations. I drew rooms with locks on the inside, not the outside. I drew women standing alone in places so high and far away that no one could reach them. Back then, I did not know what to call that. But somewhere deep down, I had already started drawing my own escape. Maybe because I was so used to looking for air on paper, when my art report card was set down on the kitchen table that afternoon, I stared at the B+ longer than I needed to, as if looking at it long enough might somehow turn it into something less dangerous. To me, it was not a bad grade. It was the only class that made me feel like I had not completely disappeared. But my mother picked up that paper between 2 fingers, the way someone might hold an object that both disappointed and embarrassed them. "You spend all that time drawing," she said, her eyes fixed on the printed grade. "And this is all you managed?" I stood beside the chair, gripping my backpack strap. I had learned long ago that explaining only made things worse. But my father, sitting at the far end of the table, tapped his fingers lightly against the wood and added in a casual voice, "Maybe she is starting to think liking something is enough, that she does not have to work for it." My mother folded the report card slowly. Life does not reward children who think they are talented just because they like to daydream. I do not remember what I ate that night. I only remember the thin chill creeping up my spine when I stepped into my room and closed the door. I opened my homework, took out a pencil, bent over the page as if I were still trying to be the kind of obedient child who knew exactly when and how to be afraid. But close to midnight, when the house had gone quiet in the way that would have sounded peaceful to anyone else, I heard them talking downstairs in the kitchen. My mother's voice dropped lower, softened in that way that always made my stomach tighten. She needs a lesson she will never forget. My father laughed under his breath. It was not a loud laugh, but it came straight through the floorboards and settled right in the middle of my chest. The next morning, everything changed so quickly, it barely felt real. My mother made pancakes. My father poured me a glass of orange juice before I even reached for it. Nobody mentioned the report card. Nobody spoke in that icy tone. Nobody looked at me like I was a walking disappointment. My mother even turned and asked, in a sweetness so unusual it sounded unreal, "Do you want to come into Chicago with us? Just for a day trip?" I looked at her so long that even I started to feel embarrassed. Part of me was afraid right away. But another part, smaller and weaker, still lifted its head the way any child starved for kindness will. Maybe this time, they really wanted to make up for yesterday. Maybe it was over. Maybe this was how my family apologized, awkwardly but sincerely. So I nodded. On the drive there, the radio was turned up fairly loud. My father tapped his fingers on the steering wheel to the beat. Every now and then, my mother turned around from the front seat and looked at me with a thin smile and eyes that were far too awake. "Do you think you are smart?" she asked. I hesitated. "I do not know." "You do not know?" she repeated like the answer pleased her. "Do you think smart people let their feelings control them?" I looked out the window. Houses slipped past us, then the roads grew wider, busier. A little later my mother asked again gently, as if we were just making ordinary conversation. "Do you think life cares whether you are scared?" I did not answer. I just sat there with both hands on my knees, listening to my heart beat slow and heavy. And when the Chicago skyline appeared ahead of us, half hidden in pale sunlight and gray smoke, I had the sharpest feeling that something was waiting for me there, and this time, it would not end with a mocking comment or an afternoon of being forgotten. As we got closer to downtown, I found myself sitting straighter without even knowing why. Maybe because everything around me was becoming too large. Taller buildings, thicker traffic. Even the sounds were different, not the familiar noise of a small town, but a colder, harder rhythm that made me feel smaller and smaller. When we stopped near Union Station, I looked up at the massive front of the building and felt as if I were standing before a place not meant for children. It was too wide, too crowded, too unfamiliar. Inside, announcements echoed against the high ceiling, suitcases rolled across the stone floor, voices blended into footsteps moving too fast in every direction. I stayed close behind my mother, so close I nearly brushed her shoulder. But then she stopped beside a large pillar near the entrance and turned to me with a face that looked strangely calm. "Wait here," she said. "Your father and I are going to park the car and get some food. 15 minutes, maybe 20. I looked at her, then at my father. "Can I come with you?" My father laughed so loudly that two people nearby turned their heads. My ears burned at once. My mother leaned closer, still wearing that thin smile. "Do not embarrass me in public." So I nodded. I always nodded. The first 15 minutes passed with hope still intact. I looked toward the doors, then at the large clock on the wall, then back to the pillar as if standing still long enough, being good enough, would somehow make everything happen exactly the way they said it would. 30 minutes passed, then 45. Then an hour. Then an hour and a half. I started walking a few steps away from the pillar, and then hurrying back because they had told me to stay there. I had $9 in my pocket. No phone. No address written down. I did not know how to take a train. I did not know who to ask for help without feeling like I was doing something wrong. Have you ever been so scared that you kept trusting the very people hurting you? I think that is the worst part. Not the feeling of being left behind. The worst part is that some part of you is still clinging to the belief that they will come back, even while your hands are freezing and your chest is tightening in waves. Then I saw the car. It moved slowly past the big glass windows at the front of the station. My heart kicked so hard I could barely breathe. I ran toward the doors, waving both arms. In that moment, I truly believed I had been saved. My father was driving. My mother sat in the passenger seat. Both of them were looking straight at me. My father was the first one to laugh. Not the relieved smile of someone who had found his child. It was the smile of someone watching a joke land exactly the way he expected. My mother rolled down the window, leaned her head out just enough for her voice to cut through the traffic noise outside. "I bet $50 you cannot even find your way home." Then she laughed. My father laughed too. And the car kept moving, slowly, as if they wanted to make sure I had enough time to understand exactly what had just happened. And I did understand. Before that moment, I was still a child, afraid of being forgotten. After that moment, I knew I had been left there on purpose. Not out of anger, not by accident, but to entertain the two people who were supposed to be the safest place in my life. If someone has ever turned your fear into their amusement, then you know there comes a moment when the pain is no longer confusion. It becomes something brutally clear. I stood frozen for a few more seconds after the car disappeared into the traffic beyond the station, as if not moving might somehow make what had just happened feel less real. But the station stayed loud. The announcements kept coming from the ceiling. People kept dragging their suitcases past me, never knowing a little girl had just had her entire world torn open in broad daylight. I turned and walked back inside, too fast at first, then slower, sat on a bench for a few minutes, then sprang back up again. I cried, then wiped my face quickly with the back of my hand, glancing around as if I had done something shameful. At first, I still waited. I waited the way children lie to themselves so they do not collapse. Maybe they would come back. Maybe this was the final piece of some stupid little test. Maybe they only wanted to scare me enough. And then they would appear the way they always did, with calm faces and that question about whether I had learned my lesson yet. But as time kept passing, little by little, something quiet happened inside me. I realized I was not waiting anymore. I had been abandoned. Those are not the same thing. Waiting still has hope at the other end of it. Abandonment does not. And the cruelest part was not only that they had left me in a strange place, it was that they had raised me in a way that left me with no idea how to save myself. I stayed away from the exits because I was afraid stepping outside would get me even more lost. I avoided uniformed people because I had been taught that anyone with authority only made things harder. I avoided strangers too, because nobody had ever taught me that some people help without demanding payment for it. I kept passing the same row of seats, the same vending machines, the same brightly lit newsstand, enough times that anyone else probably would have noticed. After almost 3 hours of that, a woman called out to me. She looked to be in her 50s, her face tired but her eyes steady. Her name tag said Maria. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" she asked. "Are you lost?" I shook my head right away, almost by reflex. "No, ma'am. I am waiting for my parents." Maria did not press me right away. She just looked at me a little longer, like she was listening to all the things I was not saying. Then she asked, very gently, "Have you eaten anything?" That was what broke me. I could not answer at first. My throat closed up, and then the tears came so fast I could not turn away in time. I started crying in the most humiliating way, broken and gasping, trying to hold it back and failing. I told her they had left me there, that I had seen their car drive by, that my mother had laughed and bet $50 that I would not be able to find my way home. I told her all of it, through sobs and shaking, and the kind of shame that makes you feel like you must somehow be the one who did something wrong. Maria did not tell me to stop crying. She did not say I was being dramatic. She did not look irritated. She just bent down a little, so her eyes were level with mine, and her voice was so steady and warm that I remembered it for years afterward. "Listen to me," she said. "Right now, you are safe, and I am going to help you." Within minutes, everything around me began to change. It was no longer the lonely panic of a child trying to make herself invisible. Someone called security. Someone moved me to a brighter place to sit. I heard a radio crackling. Fast footsteps, but no chaos. For the first time that day, the adults around me were not acting as though my fear was entertaining. They were treating it like it mattered, like I mattered. After that, things moved quickly in the way only adults can when they know something serious has happened. A security officer sat down and asked me a few short questions in a calm voice. Then two transit police officers arrived. One took my statement, while the other went to review the security footage near the entrance. I sat in a hard plastic chair, holding a warm paper cup of water in both hands, listening to the static of the radios and the sound of shoes moving back and forth in the hallway, feeling shaky and hollow all at once. Nobody told me to stop crying. Nobody looked at me like I was inconveniencing them. That alone felt so strange, it scared me. A little while later, the officer who had reviewed the footage came back. He spoke quietly to the other officer, but I still caught a few scattered words. I had been standing there a long time. The car matched exactly what I described. It had slowed down outside and then driven off. I did not fully understand what those details meant. I only felt the room around me grow heavier, more serious, as if my story had finally stepped out of my own head and become something other people could see. When they called my parents, I only heard half the conversation. At first, the officer's voice was even and professional. Then, little by little, his expression changed. He went silent for a few seconds, as if listening to something too ridiculous to respond to right away. Then he looked down at the paperwork in his hand and said, slowly and clearly, "Ma'am, leaving a 12-year-old child alone in a major train station is not a lesson in independence. It is child abandonment." My whole body went cold when I heard that, not because the words were too harsh, but because they fit too perfectly. Up to that point, everything I had lived through had always been wrapped in prettier language. Discipline, toughening me up, making me stronger, preparing me for the real world. That was the first time anyone had called it by a name, with no place left for grown-ups to hide. That night, they brought me into a small office with soft yellow light and a potted plant in the corner. A social worker sat across from me, her voice very gentle. She explained that I would not be going straight back home as if nothing had happened. There would be emergency placement for me, while the court reviewed the case. I listened with my heart pounding so hard it felt squeezed tight. I was afraid of everything I had ever heard about being taken away from your family. Afraid of strange places. Afraid of sleeping in an unfamiliar room. But mixed in with all of that was another feeling, small and fragile, but real. Maybe the world outside my parents was not entirely what they had taught me to believe it was. In the days that followed, in court, they showed up well-dressed, as if they were simply dealing with some inconvenient misunderstanding. My mother wore a dark blue coat and pearl earrings. My father leaned back in his chair, his irritation carefully controlled. They did not deny leaving me at Union Station. They just used nicer words for it. Resilience, discipline, the real world. I sat across the room and listened to them talk, as if my fear were just a small detail being exaggerated out of proportion. When the psychological report was read aloud, I heard the words land one after another like nails driven into wood. Humiliation, neglect, emotional abuse, escalating danger. Then the judge asked me whether I wanted to return to live with them under supervision. I answered almost immediately, without looking at either of them. No. What hurt the most in that moment was not only what they had done. It was that even with everything dragged into the light, they still sat there with calm faces, as if the only person overreacting in the whole story was still me. I was placed with Mark and Laura Bennett on an evening when every part of me was so exhausted, I barely had the energy to be afraid anymore. And yet the fear was still there, clinging to my skin like a reflex that would not let go. The car stopped in front of a modest house on a quiet street, with a porch lit by warm yellow light. I remember standing on the front step for a few seconds, looking through the glass and seeing family photos on the wall. A coat draped over the back of a chair, a pair of shoes left crooked by the door. Nothing about it looked perfect in the way magazine homes do. But that slight messiness made it feel lived in, like a place where actual people existed, not a place forever straining to look proper. Laura was the one who opened the door. She did not kneel down and hug me right away. She did not say anything grand. She simply stepped aside and asked in a gentle voice, "Would you rather have spaghetti or soup?" I stood there gripping the strap of my bag, not knowing how to answer. In my old house, not knowing was usually treated like a fault. But Laura only gave a small nod, as if my silence itself were a valid answer. Mark carried my bag inside, then turned and asked, "Do you want the hallway light on or off tonight when you sleep?" I looked at him. That question confused me more than difficult ones at school ever had. I had never thought my feelings might be something adults considered when making a decision. On a little, "If that is okay?" I asked softly. "Of course," he said, as naturally as if it were the simplest thing in the world. Dinner that night was quiet. Nobody pushed me to explain anything. Nobody told me how grateful I should be. I ate a few bites and then suddenly burst into tears without warning, unable to stop. Laura simply set the box of tissues near my hand. Mark looked away in the kindest way, as if giving me the last small bit of privacy I still had left. Nobody laughed, nobody sighed, nobody told me I was making too much of it. That first night, I barely slept. Every car that passed on the street made me flinch. Every creak of the wood floor in the hallway made my whole body go rigid. I lay curled beneath the blanket, waiting for something bad to happen, just because I had trusted the feeling of safety too soon. But mixed in with all those reflexes was a realization so painful it made my throat ache. A stranger at a train station, and two people I had only just met, had given me more of a sense of protection than my own parents ever had in all those years. The days that followed were not some miracle. They were small, slow, and repetitive, to the point that at first I did not even realize it was healing. Laura always knocked before entering my room. Mark left an old photo book on the table for me, along with a new sketchbook, as if he could see something in me without needing me to explain it. At school, in therapy, at dinner tables where the sound of spoons touching bowls was perfectly ordinary, I slowly learned that not every word from an adult was a trap. Some people ask because they want to know what you need. Some people keep their promises without making you pay for trusting them. By the time the adoption was finalized, I was old enough to understand that a name can be a wound, but it can also be a door. My old name belonged to the little girl standing in a train station with $9 in her pocket, and panic turned into a wager. Megan Bennett became the name of the person who finally began to live like someone with value. In a house where safety did not come through grand speeches, but through quiet things repeated every day, so gently they barely made a sound. I grew up out of that old house the way people walk away from a fire, never looking back unless they absolutely have to, and carrying the smell of smoke longer than they ever expected. In the years that followed, I studied design, left Illinois, and built a life busy enough and peaceful enough that the past no longer pushed into every single day. Years later, after I got married and became Megan Calloway, I changed my phone number, blocked every old account, and learned to call peace by ordinary things. A kitchen filled with morning light, work built by my own hands, a man who never asks, "What is wrong?" in that sharp, suspicious tone, but simply sits beside me until I am ready to speak. I did not forget. I just stopped living as if what happened to me still had the right to define me. Then the 29 missed calls appeared. The voicemail was not from my mother, it was from Hannah, my sister. Her voice no longer carried anything of the little girl who used to run barefoot down the hallway behind me. It sounded rougher now. Slower, like life had passed over her with no gentle hand either. "Megan," she said, and hearing my name in the voice of someone who belonged to that old place was enough to tighten my chest. "I think you should know. Mom has late-stage cancer. Dad had a minor stroke a few months ago. The stores, they are gone." I said nothing. Hannah kept talking, and the more I listened, the more I understood this was not really a story about illness. My mother had commented on a social media post, saying children these days needed harder discipline. Someone in town recognized her name. Then someone else brought up the old story. Then a court record got pulled up. Then a former employee from one of my parents' stores spoke out. That was all it took. A town that had once protected my parents through silence turned around and tore them apart with that same silence the second it was broken. Their reputation collapsed first, then the businesses, then the relationships they had always assumed would stand by them forever. "They live in subsidized housing on the edge of town now," Hannah said. They want to see you? When I heard that, something inside me turned cold. Not because it hurt, but because it was so clear. Clear in a way that was almost cruel. They were not looking for me because they had finally understood what they had done. They were looking for me because they had run out of options. Out of money, out of status, out of people to command. I asked Hannah why she was calling. She was quiet for a moment, then said in a very small voice, "Because I wanted you to hear this from someone who would not lie to you." 2 days later, I flew back to Illinois. Not to save anyone. Not to go back and become the obedient daughter carrying the weight of consequences grown people created. I went back because some doors do not truly close until your own hand touches the handle one last time. The hospital room smelled like antiseptic and decline. My mother lay in bed, thinner now, but her tears still came just as quickly as ever, as if her body had never forgotten how to pull every eye in the room back toward her. My father looked visibly older, but the first words out of his mouth were still spoken in that same tone of a man who believes that if he chooses the right words, everything can be made lighter. "We made mistakes," he said. I looked at him for a long time. Mistakes? My mother sniffled and reached for a tissue. My father avoided my eyes for exactly 1 second, then looked back at me, as if he still believed the truth could be negotiated. I shook my head. A mistake is missing a turn. A mistake is picking up the wrong key. What you did was intentional. The room went so quiet I could hear the steady rhythm of the monitor at the head of the bed. I brought up Union Station. The large pillar near the entrance, the $9 in my coat pocket, their laughter through the glass when I thought I had been saved. I did not raise my voice. That was what made my words sound even colder. "You turned a child's fear into a wager," I said, "and then you spent 20 years giving it nicer names so you would not have to live with the truth." My mother started crying harder, but that sound no longer threw me into panic or made me feel responsible for soothing her. I just stood there, straight-backed, as if my body finally understood it was no longer the body of the little girl in that train station. Then I said the words I think I had carried inside me almost my entire adult life. "That day, the two of you bet on whether I could find my way home. I did. I just did not go back to yours." My father asked, almost in a whisper, whether this was goodbye. I looked at him and understood that even now he was still trying to give this moment a name that felt easier for him to bear. But for me, this was not goodbye. Goodbye had happened a very long time ago, on the day they chose to drive away without looking back. This was simply the truth, arriving late and finally standing upright in the middle of the room, leaving no space for anyone to slip around it. I left the hospital after exactly enough time to say what needed to be said. No more. I did not turn back at the door. I did not stop in the hallway waiting for anyone to call after me. And I did not carry with me that sense of triumph people always imagine must come when you finally confront the ones who hurt you. What I felt was not loud like that. It was simply clear. Clear as the glass of a door that had just closed. Once I got to the parking lot, I realized my hands were shaking. Not the shaking of panic, and not of regret. It felt more like the tremor that comes when you have held something unbearably heavy for far too long and then suddenly set it down. Your body does not know what to do right away with all the empty space left behind. I stood beside the car for a while, breathing in the smell of sunlight, asphalt, and cold wind, then lifted my eyes to the pale gray sky over Illinois. This state had once held the smallest, most frightened version of me, but this time it could not hold me anymore. On the flight back, I sat by the window and watched the clouds drift in thin layers beneath the wing. From that height, everything below looked smaller. The roads, the rooftops, even the places that once made you believe you could never survive leaving them. I thought about the 12-year-old girl standing in Union Station with $9 in her pocket and a heartbeat so wild she thought she might faint. That little girl used to believe that being abandoned meant she was not worth keeping. She used to believe that if even her own parents found her fear funny, then maybe there really was something missing in her. But she was wrong. The thing that was wrong was never in her. Never. She was not rejected because she had no value. She was hurt by two broken people who mistook cruelty for strength, who mistook making someone tremble for teaching them how to grow. Some people use beautiful words to cover ugly things. They call abuse discipline. They call humiliation toughness. They call a child's fear preparation for the real world. But changing the name of a wound does not make it hurt less. It only makes the person who caused it sleep better. I leaned my head back against the seat and closed my eyes. By now I understand that leaving the people who hurt you, even when they share your blood, is not always cruel. Sometimes it is the healthiest form of saving your own life. Once I stood in the middle of a vast station with no idea how to get home. Now I have somewhere to return to. A house. A name. A life. A love that never makes me pass some test before I am allowed to stay. And maybe that is the closest thing to a miracle I have ever known. Real love does not laugh when you are afraid. Real family does not test whether you can survive without them. Home is not where you are harmed. Home is where the fear inside you is finally allowed to lie down. Maybe the strangest part after something like that is not the moment you leave. It is the very ordinary mornings that come after. You still wake up, you still make coffee, you still hear water boiling in the kitchen. You still smooth the edge of a tablecloth or brush dog hair off your sleeve, and then one day, without warning, you realize your heart is quieter than it was yesterday. Not by much, but enough to know the wound is no longer driving your life. I think that is how real healing happens. Not loudly, not dramatically, just in the moment, when you realize you are no longer living to beg for love from people who never knew how to love you the right way. If you stayed with me all the way to the end, then maybe somewhere in this story, you touched a memory of your own. And if you want to stay for stories like this, stories about loss, truth, and the way a person rebuilds a life from broken pieces, you can gently hit subscribe. I would love to know where you are listening from. And when you hear the word home, what is the very first thing that rises in your heart? If you have ever had to build your own peace with your own hands, leave me a line in the comments.